everyone, and welcome to this briefing by the members of the Commission of Inquiry on Syria. We have with us here today Paulo Pinheiro, the chair of the Commission, and Karen Abuzayd and Hanny Megally, also from the Commission. I guess they'll make some remarks and then take your questions. Welcome.
Okay, it's all right. Good afternoon. I just have a very short introduction to the statement that we are launching today. We are extremely concerned about the current military escalation in Idlib and northern Hama. Since the beginning of this year, we have been investigating deadly attacks against civilians by the state and its allies. These have also impacted medical facilities, markets, schools, and other civilian infrastructure. Additionally, we have investigated shelling by armed groups, including HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, that have resulted in scores of deaths and injuries. The current aerial and ground offensive by the Syrian government and its allies is a serious escalation that has resulted in scores of civilian casualties, including children, with the span of 1 week. Over 150,000 women and children and men have been displaced. Given Idlib's particularly vulnerable population and its location, an all-out conflict could generate an unimaginable human rights and humanitarian catastrophe, one in which the patterns of violations we have documented would very likely to be amplified on a massive scale. Meanwhile, in eastern Syria, tens of thousands of civilians displaced in the final campaign against the territorial holdings of ISIL, including women, children, and family members of terrorist fighters, are being held in limbo under dire humanitarian conditions. They are being treated as security threats and have only marginal access to food and medical care, resulting in some cases in deaths of injured or sick women and children. At the Al-Hol camp, holding over 73,000 individuals, some 15% are third country nationals, mainly women and children. Many of their countries of origin are refusing to repatriate them, and in some cases are seeking to strip them of their nationalities to prevent them to return. The ICCPR states very clear, and I would presume that all member states are very aware of that, no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of the right to enter his/her own country. States contemplating such drastic action as stripping citizens of their nationalities should, at a minimum, respect basic principles of due process, including the right of a hearing and an appeal. The Commission is particularly alarmed by the situation of children who are vulnerable to being left without a nationality. Stripping parents of their nationality will also have direct consequences of these children. Offers by states to repatriate children without their mothers, moreover, may run counter to the principle of the best interests of the child. We note that several thousand detainees, mainly men and boys of fighting age, including hundreds of foreign fighters from nearly 60 countries, are being held incommunicado. As we have stated in the past, incommunicado detention risks creating an environment where torture and ill treatment can be perpetrated with impunity. We urge SDF to allow all detainees to be visited by an independent international humanitarian organization and human rights monitors. Finally, for the past 8 years, the Commission has worked to strengthen efforts aimed at holding accountable perpetrators of atrocity crimes and grave human rights violations. The untenable situation in Eastern Syria today only contributes to further instability and the response by the international community in applying a one-size-fits-all approach where prolonged internment, incommunicado detention, or citizenship revocation are seen as the most suitable solutions, but thus far have done little for the overall cause of justice. In this respect, I said in the beginning, I draw your attention to a statement we are issuing today on this matter, which you can pick here and in a hard copy. Thank you very much.
Mr. Pinheiro, thank you very much. On behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association, welcome. Thank you for doing this press briefing. My name is Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. One of the issues is, as you mentioned, the vast number of people in Al-Hol, in the camp, who are former fighters for the Islamic State group and others. Are you trying to contact them? Do you have people who can get to them to talk to them about what actually happened and evidence for what the Commission is doing?
Okay. Thank you for the question. We have to differentiate, obviously, between the displaced who are at Al-Hol camp and the suspected fighters or people of fighting age who have been taken away into detention and are being held incommunicado, and nobody has had access to them, and we don't really know their situation. And what we've said in the statement is we're concerned that incommunicado detention creates the environment for abuse. But within the camp itself, it's more the families, the children, and there we have been trying to, we don't have access to the whole of Syria, let alone to this area. So through our investigators, we are trying to be in touch with people in the camps to understand how they got there, why they got there, and also the conditions that they're living under at the moment.
James Bays from Al Jazeera. I'd like to ask you about the two important issues that you are raising here. So a follow-up to those that are displaced in the formerly ISIL areas. In this briefing room, us journalists repeatedly ask questions about this, and it seems Security Council, Secretariat, no one is grabbing hold of this problem and taking charge. And clearly there's a subset of these people that might go back to their own countries, but many aren't allowing them to go. But there are many others that don't have anywhere to go. Who do you believe in the UN system needs to take charge of this issue? That's the first question. The second question is on the bombardment of Idlib, which has started, and it may well be the main offensive now underway to retake Idlib. You refer to Syria and its allies. It's pretty clear from lots of consistent reporting that one of those allies is Russia, that has been bombarding places, including medical facilities. What is your reaction to the fact that a permanent member of the Security Council is carrying out things that are contrary to international humanitarian law and that may amount to war crimes?
Okay, I think the first question, I would say it's not so much someone in the UN system taking charge, but really member states who have nationals detained or in the IDP camps in eastern Syria should be taking charge of their responsibilities because they have nationals there. And our concern about either governments saying we don't want you back when, as Paulo quoted the ICCPR, essentially this is an arbitrary political decision, and international standards are very clear. You can't arbitrarily deprive somebody from entering his or her own country. And secondly, if you're going to take the drastic action of stripping anyone of citizenship, then it has to be in compliance with the rule of law and due process, with a right of appeal, etc., and a right to a hearing. So our concern is that member states are not stepping up to their responsibilities here. And of course, it's a very difficult situation, but it's actually not that difficult when you think of the numbers each state has to deal with. In terms of the situation in Idlib, Because it's an unfolding situation, the Commission of Inquiry, through the methodology it uses, we have to look at each individual incident where we are going to be saying so-and-so is responsible for this action, and therefore we attribute then a particular crime to a particular perpetrator. What we've seen in the last week or more has been the aerial bombardments. Hospitals have been hit, schools have been hit, others, and of course we've expressed concern about civilian objects being hit. We're now doing the investigations to see exactly for each particular incident where responsibility lies. And those areas we have yet to identify whose plane bombed what and where. And that's why we've left at the moment the phrase Syria and its allies. Later, maybe when we report back later on, once the investigations are done, we can be more specific about who is responsible for which particular hit.
A very quick follow-up.
Yeah.
Russia, though, clearly has a lot of influence on the situation. It's one of the signatories to the de-escalation zone. What is your message to Russia right now?
Well, we've reported, if you look back at our reports to the Human Rights Council, we have in the past reported on attacks by Russian planes. You know, you'll see several times we've done that, and of course by Syrians, and also by the international coalition, if we look at Raqqa and other places. And we've said all the time that our own view is that all parties in the Syria conflict have been guilty of grave violations of human rights, war crimes, etc. So it's not that we are being soft on any particular party. We're appalled, actually, that all parties have ignored international safeguards, have ignored protection of civilians for political gain or for military gain in this war that's going on in Syria.
On your question on the Oh, sorry, it's on. It's on. Hi, it's the voice. We wouldn't challenge any of the other parts of the UN because many of them are doing very good jobs inside, like UNHCR and OCHA and others who have presence. So we count on them. The Secretary General also keeps very close tabs on this situation, and I think all of us work together who have anything to do with Syria.
I just add a footnote. For Idlib, as I said in my opening remarks, it's very important to take in consideration that terrorist organization was shelling some populations. It's not only the case of the government, Syria and its allies, but they are, as you know, in Idlib you have a mixed match of several organizations, non-state armed groups and terrorist organizations. And the second footnote about the situation in the Al-Hol camp, we are very much concerned about the situation of the children, because some member states are using strange categories to classify the children. For instance, I became aware that some children until 10, they are not terrorists, but being older than 10, they will be considered a terrorist. I think that this criteria is completely against the principle of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. All those governments connected to nationalities present in the families of the terrorist organizations, they have ratified the convention, and we think it is our duty to remind the member states of the Convention on the Rights of the Child that has not been suspended.
Thank you. You talked about 73,000 people at the Al-Hol camp. I was wondering if you have a breakdown of women and children. And also you mentioned several thousand of foreign fighters being held by the Syrian Democratic Forces. Do you have an exact number? And since you have the United States and Russia, two permanent members of the Security Council, refusing to deal with the ICC, how do you think these foreign fighters should be prosecuted?
You'll see in our statement, we say that of the 73,000, 92% are women and children. I think the breakdown is also about 15% of the 73,000 are people from the other nationalities than Syria and Iraq. In terms of what should happen to them, I think the first concern is people in detention should be visited, should be allowed access, and we've said that an international humanitarian organization should be allowed to visit people in detention, because incommunicado detention for us is always a concern that it often leads to abuses. The reality is the member states are reluctant to take back their nationals who may have been involved in terrorist activities in Syria. And that brings up the question then, what should happen to them? On the one hand, they have independent judiciaries in all these countries that ought to be able to deal with this problem if we don't make it a much bigger problem. If they're not all sitting in one place, but they could go back to their countries, maybe the problem could be much easier to handle. And then it's a question of evidence, it's a question of rehabilitation, it's a question of punishing those who have been involved in crimes, but also looking in different ways at those who may have been in Syria but were not involved in grave violations, etc. Our worry is the sort of one punishment fits all sizes, which seems to be the approach. Everybody's being painted with the same brush, when in fact people may have gone for different reasons, people may have been involved at different levels in crimes committed, and not everybody went radicalized, and not everybody coming back is the same level of radicalization. And we need to be sophisticated enough to tackle this.
Just to add and emphasize that the children are often deemed to be guilty. I mean, sorry, the children that many of the countries don't want their children back. They're very worried about how they've been better indoctrinated, perhaps, and even the adults, and so there's a real concern there as well.
No, we don't, because they're being held incommunicado, and nobody actually has a precise figure on the numbers.
Nobody knows. We are in good company. There's no access. And we prefer not to estimate numbers that will be not necessarily correspond to reality.
Over the years, we've been reporting reports with regard.
Yes, if you want to be precise.
Yes, well, I'm trying to be nice. For 9 years, we've been reporting on your reports concerning extreme violations of human rights in Syria, and punishing the culprits. We've seen none of that. And what chance do we have now of holding persons and entities responsible for the crimes they committed after the facts on the ground have changed dramatically, and we all see it? How do you feel when you see what's happening in Syria now, and that the chances are getting slimmer and slimmer of holding people accountable?
Thank you. I think that the three of us, we do a great effort not to be affected individually by what is happening in Syria. As I mentioned, we are entering our 9th year. Our mandate has just been renewed by the Human Rights Council. That is, of course, we believe in what we do, because we are the only ones doing the documentation, that is the evidence that we are keeping in our data bank. And I think that this will be useful for the future, even if people can be frustrated in the immediate. We have done something to compensate that. In the last 4 years, we opened a contribution to different national jurisdiction under the universal jurisdiction, we have collaborated with several judiciaries under certain conditions. And we are very happy that a few cases were, in terms of accountability, were very positive in a few countries. Besides that, you know that there was created another mechanism, the III mechanism, because we don't do a criminal investigation, we do human rights investigation, and they are able to do this and to consider a large arc of evidence, because we just publish in our report what we collect. We don't use, of course, we are in contact with all the research centers and NGOs dealing with Syria, but what we say in our report is what we have collected. Then I think that if we consider the right to truth that the Syrian population must have, I think that we are cooperating for that. And the last thing that I would say, besides criminal accountability, all this frustration that some among you refers about the impossibility of the referral to the ICC, we decide to broaden our accountability, considering issues like the missing, the disappear, like the arbitrarily detained, as issues that must be considered not after a political solution, but during the discussion of the political process. And we are very glad that the High Commissioner and also the new Special Envoy are very much concerned about what efforts we can do to deal about the loved ones of the Syrian families is an important issue. Besides the criminal accountability, they want to know what has happened with the members of their family.
Thank you, Steph. Evelyn Leopold. The General Assembly has this mechanism that's supposed to delve into accountability. Does it function, and how do you coordinate with them? And secondly, I didn't quite catch who invented that 10 years old was the cutoff age between children and adults. And my final question is food and humanitarian goods, are they used as a weapon of war?
The second question, I say, you can research and you'll find what member state is establishing this category. The cooperation of the III mechanism, I think that, as Karen was saying yesterday, that is something that we're expecting very much, because they are able to do this criminal responsibility, and they have the possibility of consider a very broad nature of evidence. And our cooperation was to share with them 95% of our data bank. That is, in the beginning, it was not very easy, because they were defining what would be their interests, and also how technologically share our evidence, what we have collected from interviews, photos, videos, etc. And but now we have this cooperation is going very well, and we are very glad that with the existence of the mechanism. But perhaps there was another question.
Yeah, on the food and humanitarian as weapons of war. By some, yes. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, by some, yeah, I should know better. By some, yes, but sometimes not even deliberately, but just because things are in short supply and people are in great numbers in various places, and there really isn't enough around for them of food, water, other sorts of things that one needs, both humanitarian and these other things that people need to live even decently.
And I say that in the last 2 years, we are very much focusing on the population inside Syria, because of course we have dealt with the situation of the refugees. But today, we think that it's very important so that to consider the situation of those that will return, we are trying to know more about what Karen has just mentioned, the existing conditions of life inside Syria after all these years of this terrible conflict.
Hi there, thank you. James Reinald, PRI. Continuing questions on the foreign fighters. We usually think about them through the prism of the fighters that have come from the US and Western Europe. But obviously there's a large number of them that are from other parts of the Middle East, Tunisia, Saudi Arabia and so on, and Russia as well. So when you're talking about countries taking them back and prosecuting them, can you give us a picture of which countries they do come from overall and how things are progressing on the front of countries that don't get so much attention? And a second question as well, given that what we're seeing here is a case of passing the buck, the UN people are saying it's a human rights issue and they should be taken back, and lots of governments saying we don't want to take them back. Seeing as nobody is taking responsibility, what will happen to these people if over the longer term nothing happens?
Okay, I mean, we can't speculate too much, obviously, but we can express concern. We think there's at least 50 nationalities in the area. Some say maybe even 60 different nationalities. I can't give you the breakdown, but clearly we're in the range of at least 50 different nationalities. And the question is, some states are beginning to agree to take back their nationals. Initially, many were saying absolutely not. Some states have been saying we'll take the children, but we won't take the mothers or the fathers. And here is where in some cases, some states have been saying we'll take the young children who are obviously not of fighting age, and this artificial age of 10 seems to have come up several times, when the international standard is 18, not 10. And our concern is obviously people are in legal limbo, whether those in detention or those in the displacement camps. And at risk of losing nationalities and becoming stateless, particularly children who may even not have documentation now that can prove their nationality. And if their parents are stripped of nationality, what happens to the children? In some ways, it seems to us also quite illogical to say we will take the children but not the parents. When you think about all the standards that speak about the importance of keeping families together, and here we're inventing policies that say we'll separate children from their parents. What should happen going forward? I mean, the longer the problem festers, obviously the worse for everyone, and the more then people try to invent ways of tackling the problem. Essentially, you would think if they go back to their countries, there are enough independent judiciaries around the world that ought to be able to deal with these types of problems. People say that it's because it's very difficult to be able to bring up the evidence to be able to put people on trial. And yet, many countries have now introduced legislation that will punish people for just going to join a terrorist organization without needing any other evidence about activity, crimes committed, etc., quite severely. So in some ways, it seems disingenuous for countries to be saying we can't take them back. And it seems to also imply that everybody is being treated exactly the same way, that everybody is taken as they went there because they were radicalized extremists, and therefore that's the only way we can treat them. Whereas all the research into why people have gone to fight in Syria or Iraq, or all the research as to why people have joined extremist organizations, points to a variety of reasons that don't necessarily come back to either politics or religion, but have also a lot to do with grievances, which are also human rights related.
Do you have a breakdown of which country is doing what, and would you be willing to make that public? Because I think it's clearly got a public interest dimension.
Right. No, we don't. I mean, if we do, we would try to write it up. We're looking into all of this right now, but we don't have a breakdown.
We can't establish a championship of member states.
Yesterday, I think Mike Pompeo said in London that countries should take back at least the children who are in the camp. Yet at the same time, the U.S. Obviously has a little trouble accepting at least one of its citizens recently who had been in ISIS, and they denied that she was an American citizen. So on that note, have you had any discussions with the U.S. government on this issue at all?
No. I can say not yet also because we have regular conversations with 25 countries involved in the Syria. And of course, among these countries, we have conversations with the United States, but not specifically about this subject, but I would say yet, not yet.
So you're planning to meet with them, or when you say not yet, what do you mean?
That is, we meet regularly, for instance, with all the 5 permanent members.
Maybe it's worth adding that, I mean, our mandate is we're looking at violations committed in Syria. So once we get outside of Syria, it's a little bit difficult to look at how our mandate works other than the people are in Syria right now. We are concerned that any actions taken by any states needs to be in compliance with international standards. And in particular, if people are being stripped of nationalities, for example, that there has to be due process and compliance with laws, and it should not be political decisions or arbitrary decisions without giving people a chance to a hearing and to appeal.
Carmen Maria Rodriguez of Radio Marti, and this is following James' question. I hope I don't get fried in oil. And I wanted to ask you, most of the time I sit in the back and I always hear Damascus and its allies. And today I came to your press conference and I hear Damascus and its allies. And we've heard of Damascus and its allies bombarding northwestern Syria. Can you please mention what allies, or do the 16 nations have planes? Or the 16 nationals or nationalities represented? Who has the aerial capacity for these bombardments? Especially when we heard also of the targeting of medical facilities. Thank you.
I mean, so far it's Syria and Russia that have the control of the skies, but of course other allies are on the ground, including Iran. We don't know the extent to which who's involved in doing what, and as I explained earlier, until we've done our research with specific events to be able to see individual responsibility, we prefer to use the generic term, and then when we have specific events, we can say, you know, this hospital was hit by this particular ally in this particular way, or by the Syrian state, etc.
The practice in our reports is to be very clear about what member state organization was responsible for violations. But in this case, as Hanny said, we are discussing about events who happen is ongoing. They are happening at this moment, and we don't have specific information. Then I think it's fair that you use at this moment Syria and its allies.
If I may go back to the foreign fighters again, I was just wondering if you requested any access to these foreign fighters, and if yes, what response did you get?
Thank you. That is, for 9 years, we are every semester asking access to Syria and ask other member states to help us to have access to Syria. That is, we don't, without the access, the possibility of going to Syria, we cannot have access to a facility inside the country. We can, but of course, that is, we can. We have asked in the past access to specific parts of the territory, but we never received an answer.
I was just going to add that one reason we can't also say that who the allies are, so because as we've already mentioned, the information we use is information we've gathered ourselves, and that is, you know, we can read in the newspapers and what the accusations are of who's involved, but we can't do that. You know.